Hi, Boosh here with a quick video going over the potencies of Pictomancer now that we know the finalized ones for release. I'll start with some basic stuff, and then as the video goes on I'll expand in some more detailed nerdy optimization type stuff. To start with single target, here we have the listed potencies, their base recast time, and then a basic calculation of potency per second. Up the top we've got the ether hue filler rotation combo stuff, as well as the pip spender in Holy and Comet. Next we have the creature motif. Here the methodology is you take the motif cast, take the potency, divide it by the motif cast. That gives you a basic value in a vacuum of how worthwhile is this GCD cast versus other stuff. In actuality, for the most part in fights, you will be casting this during downtime or outside of burst, because the idea is you want to bring those GCDs into burst as like free extra damage to shift inside a burst. Ideally a Fang and Medine. Wings plus Moogle is also fine, it's like 100 potency less. That's the basic gist of it. And then for this potency per second for Moogle, what I have done here is done a sort of calculation of overall of like the chain, right? So the 2 motif casts for Palm and Wings, and then the 3 damage of Palm, Wings and Moogle, and that gives you the value of that sort of like loop. We've next up got the hammer. These potency per seconds are for just the individual hammer casts themselves to basically kind of gauge their relative value in something like burst. Now their potency per second is low, but they're also guaranteed crit direct hit. To give a idea of how to value them, we can accommodate for the expected damage, right? So direct hit is plus 25%, and then crit is going to depend on gear and stuff. I've used as a rough baseline the Summoner DSR biz, which was 58% extra damage on. And then we've got the Rainbow Instacast stuff that you get on 2 minutes. Likewise for Star, we can see this is the follow-up GCD from the raid buff part of it, and it's like our strongest attack by a decent amount. And then for completeness at the bottom, I've figured out the potency per second for the hammer stuff if you take the entire combo and the motif cast. For completeness, I've also done the same for Star. So how does that factor into our single target rotation? Now, as with the live letter and job action trailer build, Holy is in a vacuum a DPS loss. A couple of important things to note though. Firstly, the amount of DPS loss is like 1%, right? So the main takeaway from this is not to never cast Holy. You don't really go out of your way to make sure you absolutely never cast Holy unless you're doing some very sweaty tryhard stuff with specific timelines in mind. What it does mean though is that you have no requirement to send all your holies as soon as you get them. You have no require to spend them all, and overcapping is completely fine because you don't lose anything if you lose out on usages of it if you plan the rest of your rotation correctly, which we'll get into in some of the nerdy stuff. So as a casual player, the way you should treat Holy for the most part is primarily as a movement tool, because you know, ensuring that your casting is going to always be substantially more damage than weird like 1% optimization stuff. So if you need to move, feel free to use Holy. The other benefit of it not being a damage gain is you can keep storing a bunch of them and have a bunch in reserve, like 4 or 5 or whatever in reserve for when you want to do a ton of movement. So primarily it's used for movement. The slightly more advanced stuff for some gains is using it as filler in your rotation to force certain timelines on the GCD. So the 2 ways this primarily manifests is you use it to ensure certain GCDs in your combos are up and inside of buffs. The other use is as you get towards the end of an uptime phase or the boss is enraging or about to die or something, you can use Holy to fill to ensure that you end on something like, you know, Comet or Cyan, Yellow, Magenta, and then don't start up a new RGB combo because this is the weakest part of your entire rotation. So removing that and replacing it with Holies is obviously going to be beneficial. So that's the basics of the single target stuff. For AoE, similar situation again. You can see it's a similar sort of story. The creature motif stuff is pretty strong on AoE. The hammers are pretty strong on AoE, Star stuff. They did change the rainbow cast so that it has a substantially stronger drop off, which means the old meme rainbow cast, holy rainbow cast, like rainbow drip holy, is dead now. So if I go on to the next slide, you can see this in action, right? Because it used to be rainbow drip holy was a gain on 2. It's not far off, but it's not a gain over like just single target rotation using holies. An interesting thing to note about the filler rotation on AoE is it is not a gain on 3. So rainbow drip holy is a gain over the AoE rotation on single target, and the single target rotation that spends holies is a gain on it as well. This is not a gain on 3, however, once we get to 4, now it's ahead of the group, right? Basically, as a rough metric, you should be using the AoE ether hue stuff, assuming you have none of your other buttons like the hammer or sort of motif stuff or whatever. You should be using your filler AoE rotation when there's 4 or more targets. What this effectively means in dungeons is that you will want to try to find ways to minimize these RGB casts between pools and like this filler rotation in general. One way you can do this is, let's say you are fighting a boss. If you ensure that you leave that boss with like 4 or 5 pips of holy, rather than doing, 4 or 5 casts of this stuff, you can instead do holy. Because holy, if we go back to the potency per second stuff, it's like notably stronger than the filler bits of it. Same for combat. It's like not too far off this other stuff. One thing that is worth noting when we get to this potency per second stuff is, whilst the muses, the motifs, it's technically more potency per second to hard cast, say, the creature motif and then cast Pom. However, how you typically want to approach the motif stuff in dungeons is, as you're running from the boss or towards the enemies and stuff before combat starts, you are prepping all the motifs, right? Your creature motif, your hammer motif, and your raid buff motif. You're prepping all those because they have instacast and faster recast time whilst you're out of combat. So you do that, that's all stored and prepped. The only situation realistically where you might prep motif whilst in combat is you're partway through the pool and you have 2 stacks of the creature news. You might want to hardcast the motif and then spend it, because then when you come out of that encounter and you're running towards the boss or the next pack, you will have the motif to instacast, to prep, and have ready the 1 stack that you have remaining. So you don't never cast the motif stuff, but in general you want to, if possible. Like, you never cast it in combat if you could have precast it whilst getting towards combat. Other than that, it's the usual thing of spend your 1 minute and 2 minutes in trash, because trash is scary in dungeons relative to bosses. And then if you're doing filler, try spend as many holies and comets as possible to reduce the number of red, green, blue, and cyan, yellow, magenta. But yeah, so that's AoE. There's not really much more to it. It's just, general dungeon tips, and 4 targets is when you start using this ether hue AoE rotation. For the single target stuff, to now go into a bit more detail. I mentioned holy usage and not wanting to use holy because it's a DPS loss, but that not always being the correct mindset to apply blindly, right? So at the top, we've got a very basic example, right? Of, let's say you've looped through stuff, you end up at the same point of like no resources, same point in the timeline or whatever, and you have this many GCDs to finish before the boss disappears. Doing the red, green, blue, holy, red, green, blue, cyan, yellow, magenta, comet, holy stuff, so you're spending holies as you get them, is this much potency. If you deliberately never spend holy but finish on red, green, then you've lost 120 potency despite skipping out on holies, right? The more important thing is trying to eliminate these red, green, blue casts if possible based on the timeline. So we've got a example here, and I've got a couple more examples on the next page. If we do red, green, blue, comet holy, this is, you know, spending when we get them, assuming we didn't bring any in, this is our baseline sort of potency per second and potency. If we do holy and don't comet, then we actually lose a fair bit of potency. It is worth noting that this is 0.8 seconds less cast time, right? So if the 0.8 seconds less allows you to squeeze in an extra GCD, this might be preferable. The other situation in which you might want to do this is if it's going to be long downtime and you don't want to spend the palette gauge in order to flip to get just the comet. Because if you're doing that and then you time out the stuff, you've lost out on a cyan, yellow, magenta combo. Another approach we could take is to red, green, blue, palette swap, cyan, comet. That's our highest potency. It's also slightly longer, 21.6 rather than 20 seconds or 20.8 seconds. So again, it's the same situation of if we can fit these in, then this is preferable. We have some other options as well though, right? If we compare for like the 20-second stuff. We have a situation in which we've got a bunch of holies. We holy, red, green, blue, holy. This turns out not very good for this particular cutoff. What we can do, and it's worth noting, this line as shown is impossible, but what you can imagine instead, the reason I'm showing it like this is because I'm not, you know, showing an entire timeline of like a 6, 8, 10-minute fight or whatever, right? This filler holy, or any of these filler holies, can be early in the rotation, and essentially your starting point shifts instead. But if you are functionally replacing a bunch of GCDs with all these holies, then that is 120 potency gain over this, you know, generic red, green, blue, comet holy line. It's also technically slightly shorter. So this would be a common thing if you're mapping out this sort of entire fight to optimize. This would be a thing if you're not mapping out, but you get towards the end of a phase or like the boss is about to die and you can squeeze these in. That's the sort of consideration. And we can see how this varies with different, you know, GCDs left after clean loops until boss is dead, right? One thing that is interesting to note is that as soon as you are able to squeeze in comet or, you know, any of the cyan, yellow, magenta stuff, all this holy filler stuff stops being a game. So if the timeline is such that you finish on any of these, then holy filler is beneficial. If not, then this potentially becomes a problem. The exception to this is when it's like downtime stuff, right? Because this costs you gauge. If the downtime is long enough, you might not actually get the cyan, yellow, magentas. You've sort of wasted some of the benefit of the gauge. Again, that will be more fight time learning stuff. So yeah, that's a broad overview of how you want to kind of conceptualize holy for like timeline stuff. This is more an advanced thing. Beginner players, you don't need to worry about this. The most you can kind of think of is if you're getting right towards the end of the fight and you're like, oh, I'm not going to have many GCDs left, you can just spend your holies. Yeah, and then we've got burst consideration stuff. So to go over the burst, I'm not going to bother with the opener stuff because that will be, you know, set up on the balance and be pretty set in stone. With regards to timeline adjustment for alignment stuff using holy as filler, the basic gist of what you want to do in optimal circumstances is you want to subtractive palette before your raid buffs come up and have one of your RGB combo prepped. An important thing to note about the combo system is the combos don't break. So if you palette swap after you've done a red combo, you don't start on the cyan, yellow, magenta. You start from yellow, magenta, and then you would loop back around to cyan. Likewise with other stuff, you can like do a hammer in between stuff and it doesn't cancel it. With that in mind, if we set up like this, what it ensures is that we, from our palette, we've spent our 3 cyan, yellow, magenta stacks. We turn a holy into a comet here. We then palette swap again, and because this combo is partly progressed, we get yellow and magenta, and then another comet, and then there's going to be a cyan outside of buffs somewhere over here, right? What that functionally does is because cyan is 800 potency and comet is 880, we've gained 80 potency under buffs. So this is relatively minor optimization, because if you are in a fairly buff heavy party, you know, 5 sets of 5% buffs. All the damage stuff's been standardized to 5% and, 20 seconds. If you have 5 of those in your party, then what you're losing for not doing this setup stuff is 8 potency and buffs, which is like 22 potency. So it's really minor. But in as far as this is concerned, the way you enable yourself to choose what combo you're setting up on before buffs, because you don't want to drift this, right? You want to send out as soon as possible. The way you ensure this is by filling early in rotation with Holy, like shift it along so it lines up like this. In terms of the actual buff windows themselves, there's a document at the moment on the balance that goes over some of the burst stuff. This is mostly good. Like what they've shown here is the optimal one. There are a few tweaks you can do for alternative lines or to slightly loosen up the window, which I'll go over. So the general gist, to go over the ideal 9GCD burst window, is you set up like this, you comet, you palette swap, you yellow, magenta, comet, do your star follow-up from your 2 minutes, do 1, 2, 3 of hammer, and then rainbow right at the end is instacast, snapshot that 1000 damage in before stuff disappears, right? It is fairly tight. If buffs came out as soon as you were pressing comet, you would have 19.275 seconds at base speed, but the actual buff's going to be weaved like late here, and it's going to be like half a second or something before, so this gets very close to 20. Any sort of clipping is kind of annoying. What I haven't included showing here is all the weaves for stuff, because it's basically not particularly relevant as far as we're concerned for like figuring out alternative lines. It's like you weave creature motif that then gives you access to preferably Medine, but also Moogle, and then there's a palette swap in there somewhere, right? That's the weaving stuff. So the first improvement that you can do is cast the rainbow instacast earlier. You still have to wait until you've done 4 comet / cyan, yellow, magenta stuff and a star, because that gives you that spends the 5 leyline stacks, which gives you access to the rainbow insta. But the rainbow insta has a base recast of 2.4 rather than 2.5. So doing it this way around rather than the hammer and then the insta buys you an extra 0.1 seconds, which if the issue you're having is stuff's really tight to squeeze in before the buffs drop off, or like maybe some other people's buffs are like not perfectly aligned or whatever, this potentially buys you slightly more time. It's still going to be a fairly tight window, but this is the optimal burst. But you may find yourselves either in party finding situations or less coordinated groups, or like, stuff just isn't lining up nicely because of fight specific stuff. This isn't always going to be possible, or rather you might be able to get everything inside your own buff, but then someone else's buff might be like a little bit later or a little bit earlier or something, and then maybe you miss like stuff at the end. So what are the other alternatives? The balance stock gives 2 possibilities. It gives the 8 spell single muse, which is basically you don't snapshot the rainbow instacast inside the buffs. It's basically a failure state. You can see it's like a fair bit of loss of potency. You basically lose 1000 potency inside of buffs, which is actually significant. This is very obviously not ideal. We want to avoid doing this. We're like having a bunch of seconds where we're not putting stuff inside the buffs. So the better alternative that the balance suggests is instead you do 8 spells, but you do triple muse. So the way this functionally works is rather than potentially prepping a muse beforehand, you actually hardcast the muse inside of your burst, functionally making it a 1000 potency or 1100 potency ability with a 4-second cast time, which the potency per second is still pretty decent. So that's an option there. Now, this is a bit more lenient. The other thing you do as well is you actually then, rather than rainbow drip at the end, you swift Preacher Muse again to get 1100 potency rather than 1000 potency inside of buffs, and then this rainbow insta is outside of buffs. So if we do this, we lose out on 520 potency in buffs, which, with a heavy buff squad is 140-ish potency. If we tweak it to lower buff thing, you can see it drops less. So this is more important the more rate buffs you have, unsurprisingly. There is, however, an alternative line that you can actually buy a similar amount of time and lose less potency in buffs, but keep it on a similar sort of timeline. So what you can do instead, and this is true if you have holy pips, you can set up in like a broadly similar way, or you can set up so you do red green before buffs, and then you comment. You don't palette swap right away. You use holy, then you palette swap here. So rather than comet, palette swap, yellow, magenta, comet, what you are doing here instead is comet, holy, then palette swapping, magenta, comet. The end result being that the cyan and the yellow are outside of buffs. So you're functionally replacing a yellow with a holy. The reason why you do this is holy benefits from the ley lines buff, but it's got a shorter base recast time. So you go from 2.475 recast time to 1.875 recast time. So you've essentially bought yourself an extra 0.6 seconds of leeway. So what this means is now these times assume the buff comes out right as comet hits. You can add like half a second or something as it's late weaved here onto the time select. You get somewhere in the ballpark of like 19, low 19 seconds. Whereas here, like you add half a second, it's like, okay, you're getting close to 20. This is functionally the same as this, because one thing that you need to account for with this is to squeeze this last 1100 potency in, you're swift doing the motif and then weaving the pom afterwards, right? So you've got the animation lock of the motif cast, which, you know, half a second, 0.7 of a second, something like that. And then you're weaving afterwards. So this is actually tighter than this is. This also spends a swift cast. This preserves a swift cast. The flip side of that is this spends a holy. However, you can also do this simply with, say, a green, a red or a green, preferably a green. And then, you know, it's another 40 potency loss, so you're minus 360, which is still an improvement over minus 520, right? This, I actually think, is the better alternative if you are finding the timing tight or like people aren't aligning stuff so the overlap is shorter than like the 20 seconds. However, when talking with the guy that made this spreadsheet, there's other considerations here to do with like casts and alignment for when the buffs come out. So there will likely be situations where either of these are potentially valid, but if you can, you want to do this where you comet, yellow, magenta, comet, star, hammer 1, hammer 2, rainbow, instacast, and then hammer. But yeah, that's the general gist of the single target stuff. Obviously, the other generic advice still applies. You know, you want to, where possible, do motifs in downtime. You want to prep them before and bring them into burst to spend inside of burst. If the boss is about to die or disappear for downtime, then using swift cast on rainbow drip is a good idea because it gives you 1000 potency before the boss leaves, and then the recast time is happening when they're not targetable anyway. Anyway, yeah, that's it for today's video. It's good to see that a lot of the more interesting optimization stuff with like filling with holy has been preserved. They didn't do the thing that there was some fear of where they're going to make holy again, and then that basically requires you to kind of spend it when you have it. But it's also, I mean, it's a loss, but like not really. So it's like good for casual people that just want to use it for movement, but this also enables like the weird optimization stuff of like this sort of stuff. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm probably going to be doing a fair bit more videos with Dawntrail stuff. I will also, I think, make a complete job guide video for Pictomancer, but I'm going to obviously wait until I get my hands on it and you get like feels for where are pain points and little niche things like that. So this is just an overview of what to expect, what to look out for, what to think about as you're like picking up and learning and leveling, but full guide stuff will come later. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.